Wie haben sich die Soldaten und Offiziere nun in Ihrem Ort den Frauen gegenüber verhalten?
Man kann hier gar nicht von Soldaten und Offizieren in diesem Sinne sprechen. Man kann hier nur sprechen von bestialischen Horden.
Empfängt in seinem Hauptquartier den Reichsjugendführer Axmann mit einer Abordnung von 20 Hitlerjungen, die sich bei der Verteidigung ihrer Heimat besonders bewährt haben und dafür mit dem Eisernen Kreuz ausgezeichnet wurden. Bei seinem ersten Infanterieeinsatz hielt Schmückles Zug einen entscheidenden Punkt an der Oderfront, 24 Stunden gegen eine gewaltige sowjetische Übermacht, und erfüllte damit vorbildlich das Gebot der Stunde: Kämpfen und stehen.
On March 22, 1945, just weeks before the final collapse of the Third Reich, the last broadcast of Die Deutsche Wochenschau was released across the shrinking territories still under German control. It marked the end of what had once been the regime's most powerful cinematic propaganda voice. In the early years of the war, these newsreels, unified in June 1940 into a single state-controlled production, had proudly delivered stories of victory, expansion, and unstoppable military success. But by the spring of 1945, everything had changed. The front lines were breaking apart. The Western Allies had already crossed the Rhine at Remagen and were pushing deep into German land. Soviet forces stood firmly on the western bank of the Oder River, barely 70 kilometers from Berlin itself. The illusion of control was gone. This raises a critical question. What message did this final broadcast try to send? The answer unfolds clearly within the segments of this final Wochenschau. The 755th edition opened with a report on Berlin's bomb disposal units, reflecting a grim reality that had become part of everyday life. Allied bombing had turned cities into death traps filled with unexploded bombs waiting to detonate. The central figure, Captain Acti, was presented as a symbol of courage and control, credited with defusing 1,016 bombs. He had been severely injured, even blinded for a year, yet was shown as unbreakable. This was no accident. The regime needed to project strength, even while surrounded by destruction. The next segment revealed something even more desperate. Civilians being trained to use the Panzerfaust, a simple but deadly anti-tank weapon. The footage pushed one clear idea: anyone could fight. Men, women, the untrained, it did not matter. The war had become total. Society itself was now the battlefield. Then came one of the most chilling scenes. Adolf Hitler appeared in the garden of the Reich Chancellery, meeting members of the Hitler Youth. Around 20 boys stood before him, decorated for acts of bravery in real combat. Among them was 12-year-old Alfred Zeck, and another, Willy Hübner, who spoke of running messages through active battle zones. These children were no longer symbols of the future. They were being consumed by the present war. Hidden from viewers at the time was a disturbing truth. In the original footage, Hitler's hand trembled uncontrollably, a sign of physical decline. That moment was cut. The regime carefully erased weakness, leaving behind only the image of authority and control. The narrative then shifted eastward, focusing on the Volkssturm, a desperate militia made up of teenagers, elderly men, and those once considered unfit for combat. One figure, Ernst Taberzi, was highlighted as a hero for destroying Soviet tanks with handheld weapons. But beneath the surface, the truth was harsh. This was not strength, it was exhaustion. These were the last bodies the regime could send to fight. Scenes from Breslau and Königsberg followed, showing civilians and soldiers working side by side in shattered cities, building defenses in ruins, treating the wounded in basements, and preparing for battles that had little chance of success. The Kriegsmarine appeared next, shown evacuating hundreds of thousands of refugees across the Baltic Sea while continuing to supply isolated German forces. Ships moved through danger, projecting resilience and duty, even as the situation grew hopeless. Up to this point, the tone remained controlled, but suddenly it turned sharp and emotional. The newsreel shifted deeper, showing disturbing images and testimonies accusing Soviet troops of brutal acts. Dead civilians were shown openly. Fear became the message. The goal was simple: show people the real terror to keep them fighting. This tactic had been used before, but now it reached extreme levels. They described the enemy as no longer human. It was turned into something monstrous, something to be resisted at all costs, even in certain defeat. The final sequences returned to the collapsing front near the Oder River. Ruined streets, exhausted soldiers, and wounded men sent back into combat after barely receiving treatment filled the screen. Reinforcements arrived, anti-aircraft guns fired at tanks, and chaos dominated every scene. Yet the narrative framed it all as courage and resilience. One young officer, Schmockler, was praised for holding a position for 24 hours against overwhelming forces. He was turned into the final symbol of resistance. The closing words said everything. Fight and resist. There was no talk of victory anymore. No promise of success. Only endurance remained. Taken as a whole, this final edition of Die Deutsche Wochenschau shows how deeply the message had changed in those final days. It no longer tried to convince people that winning was still possible. Instead, it called for sacrifice, unity, and continued resistance, even as defeat became unavoidable.